you run a short test, Alan?
Yep, sure. Just, oh yeah, give me this sign. Did you say something? Just want to see if it's picking you up.
Hello. This is a test. I'm going to test my presentation now. Oh, wow. Was that in the live stream, yeah?
You're in the live stream. I know, it's that. Okay. Hey. Can we do this afternoon during the break? Because it seems a little hectic.
Yes, I can
The live stream wasn't working.
when I felt it.
It's working.
So anytime, just let me know.
We'll do it, yeah.
Okay,
Well, it's time on that.
okay, no problem.
Yeah, got the slides.
I don't know if you do the intro if you read it. So.
Oh, no, I got you down. You should have known you did this.
So just to make sure it's all open, it's neat. Yeah. Keep it
separate. Oh, yeah, and I'm not happy as well. It should be. You're down. Yeah. I do it. I had when I drafted it as an animated app. Even then, I didn't really like it, but
it's okay here, when we have it on the recording.
Exactly.
It's really great start at the event.
It was a little. Thanks a little question.
Alistair's here, is he speaking or? That's all right.
Hey, Lisa. Hey, Bob. You got a bit late, my friend. You didn't get a front seat.
I know, but I was here, but Jonathan was on stage. So.
Oh, you made that?
Yeah, I made it.
Oh, cool. So how's it going?
Okay, it's good.
It's good. It's just,
It's very good.
I can't believe there's no 5G around here yet. This is the freaking city, man. I was like, I was in Soho a couple of weeks ago in a restaurant downstairs at Bodine. And like everyone was like, you know, all these guys and guys from the States and stuff.
Yeah.
Like kind of tucking into my ribs and whatever, and because like all NFL fans, so I started like streaming Game Pass, this NFL app, and they're all looking at their phones, and no one's got coverage, and I'm sitting there with 5G, and like listening to Dean 1,000 times going 5G shit, like doesn't go through bricks, and I'm going, man, I've got HD streaming in the basement.
So have I on 4G for years. You're just so old school.
Ah.
You're
you know
just a
what?
telco bitch.
Yeah.
I'm going to pay more for a service that already gives you what I need.
No one else had coverage.
Even, you know what, to the other side of the discussion, even though we are launching the technology, now we are talking about 6G now, working towards the 6G.
Well,
And-
they got the, you know, research.
Yeah.
So
Well-
everybody claims it's a strategic asset.
At times, you don't even have to at some places.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Basic.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even
Jonathan's trying to solve that problem.
Right, guys.
Make some money out of that too, my friend.
Well, yeah. Cash flow's all one way at the moment.
that's it. As I said to you, it's how do you monetize the OBE?
The OBE, you're quite right. I hadn't thought about that. James is really getting for OBE, doesn't he? Might not making profit. That's what I've discovered to my first.
James, it's really good, James, is he? He's done TADSummit for a year.
I'm basically not here, actually.
Well, he's busy because you
I'm pushing it.
deliver. Don't talk about it, deliver.
Just do it.
Yeah. He's a very, very tough man.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I was talking to Dean, that, you know, it's a complex market.
Yes.
You know, there's nothing
Regulations, and that's my concern.
Regulation and politics, actually.
Yes,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
it's the same.
Yeah.
It's like in most countries, the regulator is normally like either an ex-general that's married to the president.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of that.
so
But also, it is a global game, it's not just the UK. It's,
No.
we already did pay for work in America, you know, for the Department of Defense. So, you know, the infantry and landing on the beach and a landing craft, they need connectivity.
Exactly.
So,
oh yeah, systems is a ton of that to build up.
I'm sure they are. We got that.
Backpack mobile base stations, satellite.
Actually, I don't know what the back will look like. I thought about it, was a drone actually, but that could.
Yeah, drones.
Yeah, they do that now because it's fascinating. It's not fast. Because the amount of data there, because it's mostly IoT now.
Yeah.
Because it's
It's not voice, it's not even voice.
No. Video, is on the phone. There is like some messages or command stuff. But it's basically,
Yeah.
each infantry unit is like just mass sensors.
Yeah, each soldier now is an IoT device, basically.
I guess. Keeps down to hardware.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's it. Oh, stop. Okay.
Yeah.
Recycle.
Send another one in.
How's it going?
Very good, my friend. Yeah, good.
Been on travel.
Yeah, just presentation, a couple of presentations over at African Con.
Really?
Yeah, because we just developed as an industry standard for the Internet World Programmable, well, IX API. So that's kind of really cool for us. So yeah, did a presentation on programmability and network innovation at African Con. And then they had an internet event last week, so Cape Town. Yeah, so I left the week before where my backyard still had leaves and it was relatively, I'm not going to say warm, but it wasn't cold. I was away for a week, I came back and my backyard was like a leaf garden. Freezing cold and wet. It was 22, 23 degrees every day over there. It was absolutely lovely. Sailed last weekend. Yeah, so you can kind of pay to go on sailing boats. So yeah, it's absolutely. Cape Town is a great place to visit this time of the year. Oh really? Oh yeah. Food is just getting better and better over there. I went to a butcher shop, which has a restaurant in it. So you go to the butcher shop and you order, just pick out what you want, and then they cook it for you. I just, you know, say, and I'm kind of like, we had a good steak, right? And it was amazing. It was so good. So yeah, so good. Our company continues to evolve, and the growth is good. I mean, say one of the guys now, you know, when I started here 5 years ago, our biggest customer was probably AT&T. Somebody like that seems to be a big Deutsche Telekom. Speaking of DT, our biggest customer now is Sequence. You know, that change in terms of somebody like us serving our traditional international. So, you know, really, to actually start to address the local cloud industry, that was enabled us actually have to be against some of these
We didn't buy that
yeah, for us now to be at the set, those are the biggest customers that companies are even existing. As well. Deutsche Telekom, something called
You never marked that's the same.
yeah, so for us, that investment in just unlocking our sort of capability. So the first thing is unlocking our capability to automate it. The next step is the hardware right now. That's what we're trying to get us to do. Yeah, so and the third thing which is happening is the extension of that networking that's what it's not that much.
Right from the back.
Yeah.
If you have a good insurance, you can try it, but otherwise, you should.
Okay, so we're back and we're live streaming. So we managed to get that sorted thanks to our friends from Sipalto at the back there. So thanks for the loan of the laptop. You will get it back, I promise, even though you hate Macs. So we're now on to the second session of this morning. Sorry for keeping things tight. So this is closing the gap with Twilio. So as I said, it's an OBS event. So the top dog in this space is Twilio. They've spent hundreds of millions on marketing and are doing very well thanks to that. So it means for any other players, it's tough to catch up. So how can we do that? Well, Sebastian is going to give us an introduction onto some of the challenges there. So as most of you know, Sebastian, but he's in technology and innovation at Deutsche Telekom. So over to you, Sebastian.
Thanks, Alan, and welcome to my talk on closing the gap on Twilio. And the title I've previously chosen is Challenges Consuming Programmable Telecoms from developers' perspective. And I put here three statements. I want to share a bit of our learnings we had at EMEA, but I think given that I'm with DT, I wanted to focus a bit on what's in it for telcos and CPaaS, programmable telecoms, and actually closing the gap on Twilio and elaborating whether there is one and what it's actually like. Shortly about me, my CV is essentially the same as last year. I added 1 year in DT now, so I've been with DT for a year and a bit, attending TADSummit, TADHack since 2014, and want to share a bit my view and things I learned over the years, and now especially with being in DT. So when we talk about closing the gap on Twilio, what I found interesting, and I'm not a numbers guy, so I don't know if there is really like financial relevance in the figures, but I've found it very interesting to compare it a bit. So looking at the Twilio revenue, Twilio is considered the market leader in CPaaS by many analysts. They have a large revenue growth year by year. Last year it was $650 million US dollars. They have a very high rate of revenue per employee. A lot of customers and growth year per year is pretty much increasing. So the 2019 number is probably going to be close to 1 billion in revenue, which is very interesting. However, comparing that to DT, and again, I don't know like the relevance of it, but I found it very interesting. If we look at DT revenue as one carrier only, and not even the market leader, so and not even in the biggest market. So of one group, which is 75.7 billion euro, and net profit, I added that here, a positive net profit of a bit more than 2 billion, while Nexmo is still at loss last year. It's pretty interesting, and you might wonder, looking at that, I added a bit like to make it really to show the orders of magnitude that just one carrier is kind of earning over Twilio. What's really the relevance? Why should we even bother looking at Twilio if we make actually so much money and compare it to a rather small market, just looking at the figures? And again, maybe it's not really comparable, but I just found it very interesting talking about it. And even if we compare apples and oranges, I try to put it a bit in perspective in looking at the unit I'm working in now, and I try to find figures actually breaking down that huge revenue that we make. It's access, of course, it's fixed, it's mobile, it's various markets all over Europe and the US. I try to break this down a bit to get a grasp on what is actually attributable to voice and messaging and communications in general. And the only figure I found that is somehow I can relate to is in our annual report. There is one column marked revenue from fixed network. It's attributed to the headquarters, and the wholesale unit of DT is part of the headquarters. There's actually written that it's like this is an amount that's mainly generated through wholesale services for international carriers, including voice as well as data. So essentially, looking at that figure, that's somewhat the same revenue as Twilio. We are in the business of selling voice, SMS, and many other things, of course. And I think that's something I want to focus in. If you're looking at that very small part of one carrier out there, that makes money with connectivity. What's in it for CPaaS, and why is it a relevant discussion actually for carriers? It has been touched in the morning, by the way, very nicely, and I think coming from a carrier, my view is that it's very relevant. There's a lot of potential, and we're going to see a lot of transitionings that have been touched on as well in the morning. So from a telco perspective, we are mostly, or in the past, carriers compare themselves very often with alternative communication service providers. They would call them OTT. We call them alternative communication service providers, not to be shamed on Twitter and elsewhere. So, but it's really what it is. It's a modern carrier, very different to legacy telcos. What legacy telcos, how they produce communication, is been seen as an NT business, network technology business, that has here and there some IT systems and IT stack that's just supporting it, but it's really an NT business, and NT is driving the evolution. It's NT people trying to reinvent how they do stuff that's been done in the other world or in the other side for a long time. It's usually a local business that's supported, of course, by inter-carrier production, so to connect all the local business to a global kind of ecosystem, while the alternative communication service providers, they're in another kind of industry. They're in the economy play. It's global. You have a handful of relevant market players that you would usually compare it with. And it's both rather closed, but very differently closed. The one is closed as a community, but open within. So if you're a telco, you can very easily peer with other telcos. It's this kind of open ecosystem with interconnect agreements and all these things you needed to do in the past. While down here, you could interconnect it, but it's not done. It's walled gardens. The question is also whether it makes sense, considering it's not just connectivity, but it's usually connectivity embedded in certain contexts. And interconnecting them from an experience perspective doesn't really make sense. And then you have the view of the ecosystem. You have a very dependent one for carriers. You have OEMs that give out phones. You have network providers. You have access providers, core network providers, and many other players that somehow follow standards to make sure that on the interfaces you can interoperate. While down here, it's really not a big question. You're providing the app, you're providing the backend, and whatever you do in between is essentially your thing. So it's an end-to-end service that sometimes uses carrier technology when you want to make a classic phone call, but more often than not, that's not really the case. And the biggest difference is the one is still very physical. Of course, you do still get into virtualization in operators, but it's still physical. Your phone number is still very often, or more often than not, tied to your physical SIM. You have physical sockets at home that you can touch where the connectivity comes out. And down here, it's more or less all virtual. So it's enabled by, you could say it's all digital, but we don't do that either. So we say it's enabled by software, connectivity, and the cloud. So you have basically a global infrastructure for producing services. It's all connected. Devices are connected. And with IT paradigms, following software and building these platforms, let's say, not by putting boxes into racks, but by doing something on top of them, you have essentially enabled these communication service provider to provide communication service platforms. So where does CPaaS fit into all of that? Looking at it, I look at it, and there are, I guess, different views. I guess if you have a bit of a view from a carrier, for me, CPaaS is an API enabler on top of telco assets. So that's mostly, let's say, if you have an SMS or a voice platform and you add a CPaaS on top, instead of coming from the south and connecting via SIP or SMPP or legacy protocols, you would use modern APIs, come from the top and access these assets, augmented with various features to enable programmable telecoms. So of course, there's more than just, let's say, one-on-one mappings. What these providers do, so if you're a CPaaS provider, if you're not a CPaaS on top of an operator, but if you're a CPaaS provider, you're very often also an aggregator and would aggregate assets from various telcos. So if some telcos have direct connection in some markets, others have in other markets, what you would do is you would also aggregate that on top. And also integrate alternative communications providers' assets. So essentially, it's both an API enabler that augments assets from telcos, but also from other communication service providers, not CPaaS providers, but communication service providers. So a messaging on Twilio or on other platforms has also integration with Facebook Messenger. There's integration with WhatsApp, and now even integration with RCS as well, right? One thing CPaaS technology overall has in common, and that's again important for the discussion, is it follows paradigms driven by software companies. So differentiation is not really on the underlying infrastructure, but the abstraction allows to differentiate based on, or to produce services actually enabled by, again, most features that are common in the IT world. So you have the cloud-based production, you can go global, you can focus on local markets, and the competitors, again, Twilio does this more and more, looks at local enterprise markets and goes a bit away from attracting just long-tail developers, but really look at enterprises. You have a very fast automated provisioning and billing. That's, again, a very big differentiator to carriers. Usually, if you want to interconnect, and at least with the more conservative carriers, let's say, you have a very long time and very complex processes that you somehow need to map. These CPaaS providers usually, and if you introduce CPaaS technology, one of the essential things is to abstract that and to not, you cannot, if you go to a CPaaS provider and it takes 5 days to provision your SIP account, it's I think not really anything people would be interested in. So it's not just making assets available, but it's also having the underlying technology and processes follow up with the paradigms that is expected behind this technology. And what we see as well is a very little relevance on standards to get started. So CPaaS providers did not sit in a room organized by CPaaS Provider Association and discuss standards, how to get started, and wait 10 years and then eventually get started. But what they do is they just go out there. They go out there, they provide easy-to-use APIs, they provide easy-to-use SDKs. You start with best practices. Developers can easily, move between these APIs if you use SDKs, or if it's even plain REST APIs. And eventually, some of them turn into somewhat standards, if you wish. So what Twilio offers now is used by other CPaaS providers. It's been used by RESTCom for a long time. So you see some kind of, not really standards, but at least you see some ways certain providers do it become essentially the relevant or one of the relevant ways to do it. It's a bit like what we saw with AWS. AWS for a long time, they never standardized really anything, but for a long time, they've become the de facto way of doing cloud. And that's, I guess, the same thing we see here. You can't really get around local regulation. That's also an interesting point. So if you're a relevant CPaaS player and not just enabling, let's say, non-carrier asset communication, if you wish, but as soon as you tap into the carrier assets, the CPaaS players realize they need to play by the same rules, at least in most markets, and at least once they're big enough. So if you're with Voxbone or with Twilio, you can get numbers in regulated markets, but you need to provide as well, and they need to have processes to map the way of checking documents, of uploading and proving your residency and other things. So it's easy to get a number on Twilio, for example, from Germany, but you need to upload all your details, and they need to check it. It's very fast, so it's still faster than signing a contract with a carrier, which is pretty interesting, but still there is some kind of manual process as well involved. And the last part is that and this is, I find, quite interesting, again, in the fit of comparing here, if we see here, carrier who produces still a lot of minutes in SMS. It's a purely volume-driven business. Down here, it's very much an experience-driven business. Volume is not really a relevant metric, I would say here. It's relevant, it's eyeballs, it's access to users, and what you do on top of it. And for CPaaS, it's somewhat in the middle. It's a lot of value creation here is, of course, volume, because that's how they make money, but it's adding on top of the plain assets from carriers. And to showcase that, I did a small comparison here as well, Nexmo. So I would say that the market leaders, looking at what they do, if we take a reference price for SMS and voice, how you could get it from a carrier, not even with special contracts, just you go there, you say you want to do it, you wait a bit, and then you get access to it. What they do is they add a lot of margin on top for themselves. So Twilio adds for an SMS 55% compared to the reference price I took. For Nexmo, it's a bit less. For calling, it's close to 300% uplift. So it's really, really interesting that just exposing it by an API, put a bit of lines of code in between, allows you that much margin, actually shows the potential also for carriers, let's say, to just get such a platform and get started. And for other things, it's even more when you look at not just the bare access to the asset as such, but when you go into use cases, when you verify an SMS, once you verify phone number, you add even more. So for Nexmo, the price would again be uplifted by 33% compared to that number. Twilio adds 5 cents. And back at EMEA, we used all of that, all of these things, and we know kind of how convenient it is. For example, to just use a verification function and not implement it yourself. We implemented ourselves, but then you have problems. You need to verify the phone number. You need to make sure it's a valid phone number. You need to write all the logic, deal with the exceptions. So it's very convenient to use that, and it's in the beginning at least very much worth paying the extra money, I would say. So I think that's kind of an interesting comparison. And when I go around DT and show this slide, people are like don't even know what to say. One interesting figure is also this year. So we always say like OTT traffic is for free, let's say in quotation marks here, but what actually Twilio manages, they even manage to monetize this. So even if you do a pure voice call, VoIP call, using their stack, pure WebRTC to WebRTC, they even price this per minute and tell this to carriers. So it's really an interesting metric. They really, just because it's convenient and just because it moves away dealing with communications, you essentially consume it really as a service. They're even able to price this. I don't know what's the attribution of that for the overall figure, but it's interesting that they have a price tag behind that. So looking at that and going back of what I explained, is CPaaS a threat? Is it a curse, or rather a blessing for us telcos? And I think overall, I don't want to go through these market numbers. You can look them up. I put them in here. So the market is forecasted to be growing from to 11 billion from 2 billion 2 years ago. We have many digital transformation projects in the company. What that means is essentially process optimization and less, let's say, manual processes and more integrated processes. And communications has become a big part of that. So that's kind of where the demand from enterprise, I think, comes from, building communications into your processes and optimizing them. And there is a big potential that I think also carriers can grasp and should grasp. On the other hand, what they need to be aware of is that Twilio and other CPaaS providers are some kind of new kind of competition that essentially bring you traffic, and many carriers, especially wholesale units, are selling to them, and they're happy that they bring traffic. But what they do is they abstract, of course, from the complexity of the network. So the complexity that was kind of a protective login in the past is no longer there. You can move maybe even easier between carriers. And on the other hand, they capture a lot of value we've seen before, and also the customer relationship. And that's maybe not necessarily what you want. And what this all leads to, and this was a thought that just occurred to me recently, I hope we can discuss this a bit, is that, so if you look at it from a carrier perspective, I think CPaaS as such is evolving to something I call it here telecommunication support system, in a bit of an analogy from OSS BSS. So we have now TSS, kind of communication support system of many applications and services, which leads to actually making the role of telcos themselves, at least for communications. I'm not saying overall, you always have connectivity, but at least for communication, less relevant. And I try to depict this here a bit. Talking about this telecommunication support system, I don't know if that's a good term or not, but what it essentially shows is that we are seeing the move from a previously IT-centric service that has been produced by carriers, supported by OSS BSS, to a very IT-centric service. So it's all the paradigms telcos now try to employ, cloudification and whatever, and exposure. They tried to do this for many years. They're still trying it. I think it's very IT-centric. It has become very IT-centric, and the actual telecommunication assets are now only are becoming to be more and more the supporting functions of it. Summarize this a bit in a kind of one sentence that I'm not going to read now, but essentially should show that it was a very end-to-end focused stack. OSS BSS was only the supporting part, and essentially it won't go away. You still need to connect people, and you will need to optimize that lowest common denominator, and it's being optimized. It has been optimized from 2G to 3G to 4G, and it's going to be even more optimized in 5G. And it's still relevant also because you still have kind of, you connect the eyeballs and everyone, and you can reach everyone. It's universal, and that's what makes CPaaS also relevant in a way to have access to this. But I think the real value will shift a bit from here, because this is very connectivity driven from a carrier view, to the gateway function, where it's all about improved service experiences and also about exposing your assets in a way. And what it leads to is what it should lead to is IT-centric. What do I mean by that? A very business process supporting communications enabler that we should become, and we should really employ modern IT paradigms as carriers, because only then we're able to compete and to catch up, and we can leverage also again, don't want to do buzzword bingo, but we can leverage also new enablers that are used only by classic internet communication service providers. If we produce them and provide them as consumable assets and as infrastructure in a way, I guess we also have an interesting role to play. And to shortly, and it's going to be a bit similar graphic than the Basel guys presented this morning. I found it very interesting. I don't have this nice picture, but it's essentially leading down to the same. So if we look at this customer experience technology, and I took a quote from the website as well, where we have C for connectivity and communications, which is essentially what carriers provide, and we add experience it, and we add the enabler part to it. We essentially have this kind of evolution that we see. So this is the universe you saw this morning in a way, right? So we had NT focus with a little bit of IT. Now we are at a really converged view where it really has to go to, I believe, is that as a carrier, we need to focus on enabling experience creation, exposing our NT assets with an IT way, but it's not really that the NT part as such is it's still the core essentially, because it's the asset it's part of the asset we have. But I think making it available has to be done in a way differently. So to come slowly to the conclusion, I think there's a lot of potential in programmable telecoms also for carrier, looking at that kind of scenario of being customer experience tech enabler. There's a lot of relative margin, as we've seen before. I think the paradigm and to overthink the NT-IT split, let's say, in the past, that IT is only an enabling and a supporting organization. This will massively change in the future, and carriers who realize this sooner or later will have a huge, improved possibility in the market. That's the word now for that. And overall, there are many questions to be answered. Should you buy it? Should you build it yourself? Should you partner? Some carriers acquired. Some people here in the room are working for acquired CPaaS and so on. So I think there's a lot of issues to tackle, but overall, the relevance of it, even though the relative figure is rather small, the relevance, I think, is there, and carriers should look into that. And to kind of conclude a bit, I haven't really touched these points, but I think, and I will kind of show it on the next slide, I think these points, what makes it special, and you need to know what you have to do still consuming APIs, and there's a difference between telecoms development, app development. It's only there because carriers believe still about this special role, and looking at NT, that you need a special expertise for the NT stack, and you need to have specialized engineers, and maybe some VNFs are more special than a classic Apache web server. But overall, this specialty, I think, will disappear. And if we start treating telecoms like yet another IT application, I think once we get this into our mind, we have a very big potential of disrupting even this more or less not settled market, but market that has already evolved quite a bit of CPaaS players. And we will basically see what we saw in the past for fixed mobile. So it was two separate worlds in the past, and one did something different than the others. One, was still growing while the other already downscaled a bit. I think if we see what happened here, and that it really converged, that it really went together, and it's not yet there. If you talk about fully converged, and you can take a fixed number on a mobile and vice versa, we are not there yet. For some carriers, some are there, but I think we'll really see this happening also in the NT and IT world. So IT organizations, if they just take an API server, put it in front of the NT asset, they can go out and make telco assets available and transform themselves actually to an enabling organization rather than a supporting one. And I think that's then also allowing modern IT supported telcos with the IT mindset, if I may call it like this, to compete and find their place in the market. And then one day, the app developer, to come back at the topic here, at the call will really be just another API call. You will not need to understand complexities of call states and of traversions and so on. You can just use a library in SDK. You don't need to consume complex API where you need to differentiate between services. This will all be abstracted. You don't need to have various endpoints for provisioning a number and then for making a call and all these complexities that the non-leading CPaaS players face. You will all have this. You have this all abstracted, and essentially telecoms will just be one API and a huge ecosystem that you can hopefully integrate to build better services. Thanks. So we have a panel later on where we can discuss some of the things as well. Yeah.
No, that was excellent. Thank you so much, Sebastian. So Sebastian's going to be on the panel. So again, just for the sake of time, if Martin, if you can come on down, and you can ask Sebastian any questions you have on the panel. All these modern computers and so many adapters.
Yeah.
So, very pleased. This is the first time Martin and I have met face to face. So Martin is the founder CEO of Automat Berlin, a relatively new company, but I think is playing a very important role in this overall rapidly expanding ecosystem. So Martin, over to you.
Thank you. So, since it seems you all know each other, short intro. I've never worked as an investment banker. In the very early days, started as an electrician in East Berlin at that time still. So then I was a board professor for computer science, and those guys usually found companies. I did so too. So, and then I became a father, and I decided not to work that much anymore, being a professor and having companies at the same time. And after I didn't know what to quit actually, so I sold the companies and I quit the job at university too. So I didn't work for a while, being full-time father. And when the kids got old enough, they didn't need me anymore that much. And actually I was running out of money. So I then started working as a freelance engineer, and not to work that much. I screwed up. I signed in with one of my biggest clients. That was Deutsche Telekom at that time. So I worked for their R&D department. And I didn't really work for Deutsche Telekom like in a normal day job, but I created companies. I spun off companies from Deutsche Telekom, a couple of them, and the biggest one, the last one, is like what Sebastian talked about the last 2 years or 3 years. That was called EMEA. That's where we met. I was the founder and the CDO of that company, and that was then screwed up again. And so Sebastian, as he said, stayed with Deutsche Telekom, and I actually left and founded that company. So we actually created Automat at the beginning of the year. But as a matter of fact, the last 5-6 years, we have consumed a lot of what you call CPaaS, or I don't know about the terms, but we have tried to implement services using programmable telco. And when I was invited, I was shocked that you have this no bullshit. That's difficult. So let's see how from the other perspective, Automat is not trying to be a player in the market as being like CPaaS or whatever it's called. It's an agency. We took the best engineers from the old good old days and founded a privately held company. And we do develop for money. We do develop, automate, and host for money, or operate for money. And we do this based in Berlin. And we have an office in Poznan, that's Poland. And we work with the old partners. I do work for like at least a decade now in Poland and Turkey. So it's really difficult to get good developers, experienced developers in Germany, at least for an affordable price. So there is like our partners that represent about 1,000 developers in Turkey and Poland. And that's what we do. So I don't want to tell you more about what we do. Now more to the topic of the speech. That's closing the gap on Twilio. The first thing I'll try is I have a terminology that is no bullshit, right? So that wasn't that difficult. That wasn't that easy. So this is what we've done. We belong to the people who actually try to consume communication capabilities. And there are the players. Let's call them the players, right? No logo player chart is, and what I try to introduce is there are the CSPs. So I guess it's already kind of a bad name. Let's call them the bunch of people that actually have raw material. That's zip trunks, message trunks, number trunks, networks, or they run on networks, but basically that's what they do. That's the carriers, that's the specialized providers like the asterisks and the PBX providers, etc. That's raw material providers, right? Then there's what's called CPaaS, and there are two different kind of its categories. Like we already saw that the Nexmo and the Twilio, right? That's what I would call the leaders, and then there are challengers. You can call it anyway, but I would call it gold plating. That's basically having raw material, gold plating raw material. There's no CPaaS without raw material, right? Almost no. And then there's the fairy dust. So the question is, what offer Nexmo at USAT is a lot of marketing money. I think it's more because we know quite a lot about what you can consume and how you consume it. And I have to say, these guys are better than others. And we work for some of the parties here in the scene to improve what they have, to maybe get them closer to the leaders, right? So raw material, gold plate, and fairy dust. And maybe just now, that's a logo chart. This is the logos we've played with in the last years. So we do not know everybody, but this is actually some trunk providers, number providers, and API and SDK providers, more or less perfect or not so perfect, and those. So we have hands-on experience with this, based on the things we did for Deutsche Telekom on behalf of Deutsche Telekom and what we do now in the company. So, so still perspective with that one, but this is the guys we have experience with. So we developed stuff on top of what they have. And you can read through these slides afterwards, maybe just talking about fairy dust a little bit. So what makes a difference? I guess you know Twilio Flex. And there's a visual designer in Twilio too, so you don't even have to be a developer anymore, right? You can drag and drop and have complex call scenarios modeled without actually doing it yourself or understanding how it works. So there are interesting stuff ongoing Nexmo as well. I know there are Nexmo people here, so don't kill me in the break, right? That's the perspective from the above, not from the inside. But Nexmo and Twilio are, from our perspective, actually the most evolved providers with a lot of complex features on top of APIs and SDKs. Of course, they have raw material and gold plating, and the fairy dust is that what comes next, right? Two-factor authentication as a service, right? Or a contact center as a service. You might know that DiBa, the bank, the online bank, they moved away from KPN. I mean, these guys are so Dutch, it doesn't get more like the Netherlands, right? And they moved away from KPN to Twilio with all their data centers, all their the call centers based in data centers on a global scale. I don't know what it takes to take a Dutch company to move away from the Dutch telecommunication company for call centers, right? But Twilio did. And they actually have Flex. At that time, they didn't even have Flex. They just developed it out of this, I guess. But that's fairy dust. There are specific solutions that are not even APIs and SDKs anymore, and you have to build your stuff on top of that. And the question here, that's just showing the pros and the cons. And again, I'd only take the fairy dust and read through the other ones. They focus on the consuming party experience, what to do with it and how to do it fast. They have basically everything you could think of in the market, right? So look through Nexmo and Twilio product portfolio. It's compelling, right? And they have almost global availability, at least in the relevant markets. So they have a lot of deals with raw material providers, and the pain points are expensive. Sebastian just showed it. It's like they charge for everything. Prices were like the raw material providers, which is like, how are they doing this, right? So why is anyone willing to pay for that? This amount of two-factor authentication, you sign into an app and you get an SMS with a code. It's 10 lines of JavaScript. It's really simple and it's a database. And it's so expensive if you consume it from Twilio and Nexmo, right? Compared to the SMS and 10 lines of code, hey, that's cool, right? That's fairy dust. You really have to be bold to sell it for 13 cents per registration. And that's cool. It's expensive, but people actually are using it. Then there's not really transparency in the quality. So lots of trunks used. It's gray, I would call it, right? That's you might get into situations where you make phone calls and they're really not perfect. So I guess that's part of the business. And there's a risk for lock-in. I come to that later on. If you sign up with one of the two guys, really good ones, I mean, it's really difficult to get out of it again because you develop everything towards this. And then I would do the same if I would be in that position, right? So I invest a lot of money into this. And then, of course, you do this, right? That's just the way it works. So what's the dilemma on the market? Let's say it that way. The same picture, right? But a different top. It's the players, number of players, number of developers, and size of the market. It's already been said in the morning in many of the different aspects. So there is, on that side of the picture, there is a lot of players, right? In each country, in each region, there are carriers or specialized providers of PBXs, etc., etc. So from the raw materials perspective, there's a huge number of providers. And they represent, I took that number from I didn't know the number, so $1 trillion market. I think you said 1.2 trillion, something like that. It's a huge market, right? And at Sebastian as well came up with some numbers. Just the one carrier represents from the wholesale business, including voice, the same number as Twilio is doing on the global market. So huge market and many players and just a few developers being able, right? And very specialized system or tech stack being used. So it's Zip, it's SMPP, or if you go deeper, even SS7, Janesly, or the OSS, BSS, world of, let's call it legacy, or the Asterix, the free switches, and the you know them better than I do, I guess. But it's a very special world, and the number of people being able to consume and build complex features on that is small compared to the number of players. Of course, on the other side, it's exactly the opposite, right? Just a few players, a 10 billion market. I mean, whether it's 8 or 12, I don't know, but this is 1% of the number we had on the other side. So just a few players, even if you take the challengers as well into account, it's like 10, maybe 15 companies providing this on a bigger scale. And there's a huge number of developers. They're not specialized. They know how to actually consume a REST API. And they program Node.js or JavaScript or maybe Python, right? We have guys, senior developers, many years of experience. They actually ask me, it's like, what do you mean with XML? Right? I'm too old for that, right? It's like, what do you mean with XML? What can I do with it? Is that some kind of strange notion of JSON, right? No, just for the engineers in the rooms, like these guys don't even remember XML, right? Now come with a dial plan that is an XML file on an external server. They just look at it and say, oh, okay, I need to read some book. So there are lots of people, but they don't know anything about communication technologies from the past. But they want to build, they're hired, they want to build services, right? Whatever that is, whether it's Uber or whatever kind of service, like these people actually develop these services, and they take most of the CPaaS market, which is not as big as the other one, but much more accessible for a big number. So now, for those up here, they're actually, let's call them the consuming parties, right? For them, it's difficult to select a vendor, right? Because they're expensive, they're kind of difficult to handle, but there are lots of them, and there are few here, so it's really difficult to select the right vendor. How do I do that? Then, of course, the vendor lock-in. They're like, I can choose from the really good ones here, but I still have vendor lock-in. So the problem doesn't go away, right? There's the market. I think there are a lot of things in the morning where you describe the market it is moving. There are lots of companies buying other companies, and so they realize the investors putting a lot of money into it. They realize there's a big market, but actually there are lots of players that don't even count to be part of the market. But I think actually they're part of the market. They can be part of the market, let's call it that way. And then it's the changing requirements. The Uber case, that's a good example. They started doing this and then switched to Twilio because they had problems with delivering SMS. Twilio was good enough. They delivered the SMS within, I don't know whether you used Uber, you book a car and you get an SMS just before the car arrives. Go to wherever the pickup is, the driver will be there in a second, right? The second SMS you actually receive when you're close to where you want to go to, and then they say, hey, pick up all your stuff in the car, don't leave anything in there. So you get 2 SMS, right? And they need to be in time. And Twilio was able to do that. Now Uber decided they actually account for like 15% of Twilio's revenue, or they used to. Now Uber decided that's too expensive. Now they scale, right? They really have a lot of users, and that gets expensive, right? If you pay the Twilio SMS price, and I'm sure they get a better price from what you see on the website. But they actually decided to go with not just Twilio, but others. For instance, BlackBerry. You might remember BlackBerry, right? They have quite a massive IP messaging platform at the moment, and so they actually got away from the lock-in, right? But it takes them a hell of a lot of effort to do so. So, and there are other reasons why, not just the scaling, it's other reasons too, why it's a difficult situation. And so that's, without using the buzzwords, I would say, I would describe the situation from the different perspectives. So now, taking into consideration, first of all, of course, you could now, I think from up here, we don't want to try to be a provider in the market, so no player, but you could try to uplift those guys, enable them, what Sebastian said, there are some of the carriers that try to expose their capabilities via APIs and SDKs. So lift them up to, let's say, APIs and SDKs. I mean, Wazoo actually, the talk in the morning, I didn't know you have a platform. That was new to me. I knew what you were doing, but I didn't know how you do it, right? So there are a couple of players, Wazoo, Telestex, Restcom, etc. You can just use them, have one zip trunk underneath, configure the zip trunk, and you have APIs and SDKs, right? So I don't get why those stubborn guys I used to work for don't go there. It's cheap, it's easy. They might not know the market, they might not think that the market is interesting compared to the existing revenue, but still, it's easy. I don't get it. However, that would be interesting. That would be interesting to actually open up options to this, because they are legal, they're local, and they have high quality, right? That's the core business of those guys, that they actually provide this. Kind of boring, but they do. The next step is you could actually have a service aggregation. You could integrate, you can enable those guys, and you can come up, and AT&T is doing it with the API, what do you call it, API Garden, right? And KPN is doing it, etc. There are a couple of guys providing this in a way that you could have one place where you can go and actually consume it, the stuff, but it's still not integrated. It's just an aggregated perspective. So, but still, Nextmove is in here with KPN, Twilio is not, right? And then Epidays, I think, is in, and Candy is as well in from the communication perspective. So Ribbon. So that's one thing you could do. So that would already kind of open up the system, the ecosystem, and give options to those guys that actually are the consuming parties. Sorry, I was too fast. I already gave you that. That's interesting. WhatsApp actually is doing the same at the moment. WhatsApp and Uber is like the biggest customer of Twilio, or used to be, and WhatsApp as well decided to actually move away, not 100%, but move away from Twilio only. So you can just read the slide. It's quite interesting actually to look at it. And the next steps, if you think about it, one of the problems for the consuming parties, I can tell you, I spent a hell of a lot of nights on that, right? Is you buy numbers, you provision numbers from that provider, you use that zip trunk provider to terminate, you have that and that capability from another provider. So we integrated, like in the same service, 5 different providers for different reasons. And you know what? We were not able to sync data between clients. It's a hell. And you pay a lot we had a team of 90 people and 70 were engineers. We were not able to sync data. I mean, any kind of service you use is normal. It's syncing data, right? In the communication realm, actually now providers like Nexmo and Twilio are providing it. They have conversation APIs, or whatever they're called, where you can grab the timeline, right? You don't have to have a concept, to have a database, to store this, to sync it between the clients, to not drain the battery of your mobile phones by polling all the time, etc., etc. It's a big problem. It's such a trivial feature, actually, but it was not implemented 2 years ago. And the same thing is you want to use multiple providers for different reasons: geography, compliance, feature set, security, etc., etc. There are reasons, right? And you have to build this yourself. And it's not a 5-developer team; it's a 25-developer team, right? It's really expensive to do so. Of course, Uber and WhatsApp, they can afford it, but Uber used to be small too, right? They did not have that many money at the beginning. So that's why not have a universal API? And I think Sebastian mentioned it, that the TWIML, like Twilio, is providing something called Twilio markup language. They have verbs. It's not a standard, but actually you can see people, like we talked to Telestacks guys, said, yeah, we planning to provide TWIML because clients can change from Twilio to any other kind of provider because they implement the Twilio standard. I mean, if you make it there, right, you kind of made it. if the others start implementing your stuff. So it would be interesting, just from a theoretical perspective, to have a universal API. One API that provides everything, and all these guys are underneath. And as a consumer, that would just like wishful thinking. You are here, you just use this, you don't have any login, you get the best possible condition. I need a high quality and CLI. That's the provider. Go this route. I need a number in India. That's the provider. I get a number in India, right? Etc. etc. So you would choose all the nice features you want to have via like a de facto standardized universal API. That would be great. Very theoretical. But there was a question in the first. Could you think? I think you asked the question, right? Could you think any kind of way that the unified communication would be like all the same? That would be different. It would just be like a de facto standard exposing it, but there would be still a lot of companies being players in the market. And that's of course, that would be the perfect solution to the consuming party, because no login, no vendor selection. You just sign up, you get all the features, and those guys make money with what you do with it because they get paid by it. But of course, nothing is, there's nothing like this on the market at the moment. And I guess, especially for that point, it's not really wishful thinking, because you want to make your share in the market and you want to have your barriers to make it difficult to change between the one and the other provider. So that is that's the last thing last slide. What we've done, apart from what I told you at the very beginning, what we are as an agency, how we make money, we are actually strong believers. We want to contribute. So what we do is, apart from developing and automating for money, we implement in our spare time open source components which we think are meaningful in this picture, right? So that's more like theory, but if you don't have that structure, you just do something, especially since we do not want to become part of the players on the market. And so there's one thing, you can click on it. I might do it. I don't know what time is it. How much time do I have left? No time left? Okay. This is so we did a reference implementation for iOS developers, because iOS is very special for anyone who wants to have an iOS app. It's really difficult. So we came up with something that is open source. You can download, but it's not meant to be like a soft phone. You can use the code. We have integrated Twilio and Apto as SDKs, WebRTC and Zip SDKs, and one of the providers. And we gave description how you could develop your own adapter to connect to any of the providers, right? So just go there and read it. There's a link in the things, or there's another thing that, as I said, there are graphic user interfaces like Twilio provide the visual designer. We have started implementing a visual designer based on open source. It's called Node-RED. We've integrated a very small German provider, it's called Zipgate, but now we're implementing Twilio. And the idea is basically that you can drag and drop and configure your complex call scenarios with a graphic user interface. And we do step-by-step integrate a lot of more providers that you could actually do this on top of the providers. And we are actually, at the moment, there's Sam is sitting there, he's based in London. We're actually doing a scraping on all the providers on their conditions, prices, qualities, etc. Put it in the database, and the long-term idea is to provide something where you could use a universal API. Today we would use Twiml because it's a de facto what people do, and have a real-time decision on which would be the right route to place that call or to send that message, right? With all the different providers. So we are trying to automate the scraping of the conditions from the different providers to have a database to make that decision. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Mark. Just give us a minute just to get set up for the panels. And Mark, if you can take a seat. Sebastian, if you could come on down, Steve, and Rob. Tighten it up. You're going to have better audio than last time.
Being disconnected.
So hard to get online connections here first.
There you go. Perfect. Okay, so this is the panel discussion on crossing the development chasm. I recently retweeted, it was an excellent hack that was done using blockchain for with VoIP for privacy, calling and spam protection. And one of the comments from the developer was, boy, I learned a lot about VoIP. And that's an example of just how far we have to go as an industry when any developer that works on the APIs realizes, boy, VoIP is complex, because it shouldn't be. I mean, back to what you were saying, Martin, in terms of making it just a very simple, easy to use API. So what I'd like to do is open up to the audience. Any questions for, actually what I should do first, before I do the questions, it's apology, we have two new panelists. So Steve, Rob, if you could introduce yourselves.
First, you want me to go? Okay, I'm Rob Pickering. I've been involved in the TAD organisation, I guess, since I took a hack to one of the first TAD hacks in Madrid in 2014.
I will never let you leave.
Absolutely. So I've done things like lead the London location, done multiple hacks over the years, built and sold a telecoms company, telecom software company around WebRTC.
My name is Steve, and I'm an alcoholic. Sorry, wrong meeting. I'm Steve, and I don't work in telecoms, but for many years I've used telecoms to build other things, which are very consumer, very high level. So I'm in that position of, really, I'm expected to know this just to send a text message, and I come from that. I mean, I'm a techie. I wrote C++ 20, 30 years ago. I started off by hooking a Nokia phone through a serial cable into a Linux box to send text messages to my house to record video. You know, it would do an IR thing to my video. I don't mind the tech thing, but if someone's giving me an API or a webby thing, I expect it to behave like a webby thing, not like a telecoms thing. Rant over.
Excellent. So there's the panel. Chair.
So following up Sebastian's presentation, thank you. One question that I have in mind is, as a telecom, do you see that in the future these CPaaS players can be peering between themselves and present, a new challenge because they're doing it over the top and you're not actually aware of it, and just passing calls between them, like WhatsApp did with actually using the phone number as your ID?
I think yes. Well, in a way, they are already on the lowest common denominator, so you can send kind of calls in between. It sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't. So one of the challenges, for example, we had at EMEA was when we wanted to verify a Vox phone number, sending SMS through Nexmo, that SMS wouldn't arrive because I don't know, they blocked probably their routes. They used like no direct connects. They used gray routes or something, so it didn't arrive. So I think there is a peering. The question is whether you're going to have that on the higher level. So let's say you have one WebRTC provider and another one, Twilio providing one kind of WebRTC flavor next to another one, whether you will have a peering there. To me, I would say it's less likely. What I can imagine more is that, so peering always, it's kind of the carrier world. You have two kind of guys implementing something and then you have an agreement of how to interconnect. But I think it's more likely that you will have a portability on top of that. So if there is kind of a domination, let's say, of one standard, and on a previous conference, the guys from Web Innovations gave quite some interesting examples in the Netherlands where they worked with a client. They built an app on top of that, and that client wanted to deploy it in the Netherlands, but also in Belgium, because they're very similar markets, and they couldn't. So they couldn't move the app from one platform to another because it was not, the same interface. So I think what we'll see is more an agreement on common ways of doing this on this layer than an interconnect on the non-telco protocols, I would say, because this is simply not necessary, right? So if you consume it from, it's not needed. If you're with Twilio and you build an app on top of Twilio, anyone using that app will also connect to Twilio. There is no need to there will not be a second app using Nexmo, and you don't need to interconnect. The use case doesn't justify this, in my opinion.
The point is actually Twilio and other players trying to save money by not paying the telco beneath it, So if they peer call between themselves, they are avoiding that cost.
You could do that if you have classic, if you have classic call scenarios, you could do that. If you say, I don't know, you fall down to SIP, and instead of going by the carrier route, they have some kind of discoverability mechanism. That's actually an interesting thought. They could do that, I think, much easier, and it's much more likely than doing it on the kind of new kind of WebRTC stack. I don't know if that's going to happen. It's an interesting thought. You could essentially bypass the carrier ecosystem. I guess why not? I mean, it's a separate layer. I mean, the picture we saw was kind of breaking it into layers. But even if you don't have that concept, I mean, if they would agree on it, they could do that. The question is whether these are kind of still the first generation CPaaS carriers that are tied to the underlying carriers. And the question is, would they do this, right? I mean, OEMs could do that as well. Apple and Samsung could partner and simply bypass the whole carrier world, yet they're not doing it because it's an ecosystem. So that's what I meant with the ecosystem play earlier that I referred to. And I still think the big CPaaS providers at least are in a way depending on that because they make most of their traffic still with termination into the carrier world. So I think it's an interesting technical idea, but it's commercially, economically less likely that they will in the short term.
Okay, thank you. Remark.
Following on from that, do you see a trend where the CPaaS guys are actually less cloud, more physical infrastructure, owning their own number ranges, building their own hubs coming out of the cloud? Design?
Yeah. I think we've, again, coming back to the example of EMEA, we've worked with Voxbone, and Voxbone, I think, is doing that. So they resell carrier numbers, but in some markets, they act as independent carriers. I think also with the focus on enterprises, they will have certainly regional offices, or they will have contact points, because that's what you need once you want to go into that market. Whether they will have built up something like carriers do, like classic POPs, or whether they will focus on any location that is enabled by the infrastructure they run on. So take AWS, you would be, of course, present in all the AWS locations, because simply the way you build it makes it very easy. I do not necessarily think they will go beyond that from a strategic perspective, establishing POPs like carriers would do. What I would think though is they do more and more integration projects. So the ING sample that we've heard of earlier was presented at another event. There you see custom integration into their one of the big customers, and of course there you have kind of physical integration. So you would have a direct connect go into AWS and then being linked up to Twilio. I think this is going to happen utilizing the infrastructure provider, but I do not think they will do this for differentiation, to build up new or own POPs in the way carriers would do.
And just to contradict you, sorry, Sebastian.
Yeah, okay.
Telnix is an example where they built their own EPC, they have their own number ranges, they actually implement across their own global cloud infrastructure, a complete IoT network, so you never need to touch the public cloud. They've got their own numbers. So, but that's a vertical. They're very focused on particular verticals. In the more general case for voice, if there's already something there and the pricing is okay, why reinvent the wheel? So it comes back to your argument around the interconnect is, why break something, why rebuild something that's broken? Okay, any other questions? Carl?
I might have a question about when you are talking about the ultimate API to be a universal API. So do you really believe that's visible, or are you still just trying to figure out how to do some of those, but we know that you will never match? And so I will give you one example, which is coming from my company. So I use called Divert for my. So first, there is no API for it. So I go through to spread the user experience, because there is a pop-up from the, what we call that, carrier, the guy who does the networking. So they send a pop-up with a message that no sense to me here. On top of that, I, as an app developer, don't get any feedback, so I don't know if it works. And it depends on the network provider. So some network provider will work with 3G and 2G. 4G and 3G. Somehow they decide they won't implement call Divert with 4G, so you have to downgrade to 2G, so you can actually ask for it, which go and explain to the user, oh, you want to activate that functionality, please change your network permission from 3G or from LTE or 4G. They don't even understand. So to me, the day where, as an app developer, I can have a simple API that will do that simple functionality on any network or that. I just say it's never going to work. That's my opinion.
Well, from a technical perspective, I'd be very fine with the idea. So we could spend like a couple of hours to talk about it, but I don't think there's a simple business model. So I think from that perspective, I don't really see. You need a lot of money to establish such a thing, because enough people need to use that make it attractive for the others to be part of that. So I don't know. Rather not, I would say. The idea of showing it was more like giving you a different picture on the perspective. And there are examples in other domains. If you look into the, I call it cloud, sorry, the cloud hosting market 10 years ago, right? There were like the AWS coming up, Google Cloud Platform, Azure, and some others. It's the same situation. They do basically kind of the same thing, but on a technical level, very different. You sign into one of them, and you're locked, right? It's really hard to get out of it. Now today we have Docker and Docker container management solutions, and if you put whatever you have or you develop into a container, you give a shit, right? You can deploy to any of those providers, and a lot of others that would provide that level of abstraction. So if we would have had the same discussion 10 years ago about the hosting market, we would have said the same thing, right? We would have said, come on, no, it's not working out, right? It's like those big guys, they're gonna do everything to keep you off the landscape. And today we have Docker. So I don't know. I guess it's not gonna us to do it. Maybe that's more like answer to it.
But it is a good question, and it's something as simple as cold divert. And there isn't an API to do it. We'll pick on the telco here.
By the way, it's an interesting use case, because there is no API to do it yet. I've seen APIs. Actually, in Slovak Telecom, in the early days of EMEA, when I was still working there, when I tried to integrate it, there was indeed hidden somewhere in the IT stack an API internal without authentication or anything that you could use, and you could set directly HLR settings. They did this as part of their provisioning chain, let's say, and it was of course protected by whatever. So there was some kind of protection since we. But the interesting piece is that it was in something IT built for themselves internally, and nobody would have thought that this IT application is something that you would expose externally. But that's exactly what I was kind of referring to, that if you would have this mindset of, well, we cannot easily connect to the HLR, let's build a simple API and very easily integrate into that process. If this would be kind of driven by somebody being responsible for the business as such, and not just a small supporting unit, they would have very quickly come to the thought of, well, actually that's working, let's make money of it. We've seen this with Telesign. Carriers have internal processes of preventing fraud. We have that, others have this, yet there are not many that expose this externally, right? I mean, your Telesign for me is an enabler doing that, and many other carriers could very simply expose what they have internally with an API gateway or with an IT thinking, but we are not there yet, right? And then the next level is, of course, do many carriers do this? Do you have a kind of standardization of these APIs? But the first step of making them available, I think, is a pure mindset question. It's very easy to do. It's all these HLRs are programmable, and if not, they are just databases where you can put a very thin programmable layer in between, and you could have that,
But I'd say, I mean, after tens of billions of dollars invested in IMS,
yeah.
we still don't have it, and now of course we're in 5G, and what will be tens of billions of dollars with the application gateway that's there. Is this?
You don't have it, and that's what I mean. So I mean, IMS, the application server essentially should have been a component where you build applications on top. Yet it's not open. Yet it's proprietary in so many ways, and you need to be a telco person to consume it. So I deliberately actually did not say let's make the IMS programmable layer programmable northbound, but I said if we introduce CPaaS, it doesn't need to be on top of the IMS. It can be somewhere connecting to the resources that the telco system has, but it doesn't need to be in this complex IT-ified NT world. It can be an IT application on top of the assets directly, and that would be IT driven and not driven by the complexity of the telco people. It's the same thing with virtualization. We try to do something IT did for many years and has a lot of experience now with the NT stack, and of course there are challenges, but it's not rocket science. Yet we treat it like it, and that's I think the mindset of it being special, and the mindset of over engineering certain things and engineering by committee and so on. I think there are many reasons for it, and it needs a drastic change in how we think we produce services and how we think we actually treat our assets. Do we expose them to enable, or do we close them and try to keep our complexity on top of it to differentiate by that, or to live longer in a way, to extend our life? I don't know.
Moving on, just technicality.
So last year, a year ago, Twilio acquired Core Network Dynamics, which does EPC network calls. Any idea of what they're doing, and whether that means that they've got a defensible moat in some of their business areas, by essentially either that's becoming a thick MVNO or something else? Or is it just about IoT?
Can I?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, they look at the carriers and they see they don't move. So it's more likely that they become a carrier than the carrier becomes CPaaS. That's it. If they have a lot of money, right, and they think about how to spend the money, and then I'm sure they don't like to have these complex contracts with 100+ carriers to terminate. So if I be Twilio, I think about it at least. And then, of course, they don't have the, let's say, the expertise, so they buy these companies. That would be my, actually, if you are like an investment manager in Twilio, what would you invest into?
Yeah, I was thinking specifically about having its own EPC. Is that about being an MVNO? Is it about doing private networks? Is it
all of the above?
Yeah, the front end, so contact centers, you can differentiate between fixed and mobile. Yeah, there's a lot of people doing rolling their own EPCs, but I don't hear it from any of the CPaaS players.
But there's one specific technical reason they might want to do that as well, and it's around text fraud and authentication. That if you're just zapping text out to the network, there are a whole bunch of known hacks around, the SS7 hacks, SIM swaps, and the new fantastic Ofcom port numbers in 10 seconds process. And if you've got visibility into the telco interconnect, you can start looking at some of that as part of your differentiation on fraud control. And I know Twilio are doing a lot of work on that, and that's how they justify the 13 cents for an SMS versus someone who's just doing A to Z routing of the SMSs, and half of them are going to the bad guys, and they're authenticating bank accounts based on all of that stuff. So even without the kind of the commercial stuff, there might be technical reasons they want to start looking like a telco, or seeing inside the telco actually.
I think I can say Alex raised his hand.
Hi, if you don't know me, I'm Alex Finch. I founded the Siron campus 9 years ago. We are sort of a wholesale version of Twilio with about £5 million less funding. We are on the edge of CPaaS, so we are a wholesale traditional carrier, but we are completely API driven, we are completely self-service. That was a necessity from day one because we had to be for a small team. What's interesting is on the sort of API and the call control language extraction, is it in Twilio's interest to make their APIs and their call control language open to everybody else? No. Is it in Nexmo or Telnex's interest to build a call control language that's like Twilio and an API that's like Twilio's API and allow you to plug in? Yes, of course it is. So for the challenger, I feel it's it's in their interest to support, keep the portal away, but it's not really. I don't want to use the word companies here, but the elements are almost there. It's not in their interest to say let's have a standard. This would be great. I think Martin said that Twilio, like a language that's kind of a veneer over other providers, that's great. Translation tools are really fascinating. When you try and translate the Twilio API to look like Nexmo API, to look like Zara API, or the Telnix API, it doesn't quite work because different people do different things, different words, different objects, different ways of doing stuff.
Different timings, there's a whole bunch of things.
It starts getting messy. Now, the alternative is we spend the next 20 years trying to create an XML-based API that's really outdated because everything is back in the XML now. Yeah, 4.6 now. The GSMA API, great idea, terrible execution. So, Twilio and everybody else is coming out and we'll just create an API and everybody else will follow. So, I guess my question is, should this sort of telco development of the future or anything else should be somewhere like the open source community? Should it be like a project like Kubernetes where it's developed by the web guys, the cool guys, the Googles as well? Should we be taking this as a page from the GSMA so that we as well?
Martin, you're actually brave to say GSMA in this room, right? I was not brave enough. But I don't have practice with this. It's an answer to the other question. Basically, I actually see that, like Google, for instance, might be the right address to do so, because they did a lot of other things that became de facto standard in open source. So, and I can only say yes to what you stated, because we try to map at the moment different providers to Twiml, and they do implement everything in a very different way. So different orders, like I don't know whether you know Twiml, but it has verbs. So it has like modular parts of it, and it's really kind of difficult, and I don't know whether it's the right way to match it, right, on the semantic level, or to go some totally different way. I can only say, yes, you're right. It's trying to use a de facto existing standards like Twiml and match it to the other providers. It's a difficult job, if not impossible.
Yeah, my experience has been every vendor that claims they have their version of Twiml, they don't. Because response time for a particular sort of command is different. And its application, if you written, has a certain weight before it gives up. And as a result, you have to rewrite some of the code, you have to work out all these like internal parameters. And of course, Twiml is constantly evolving, so it's a game that you're constantly playing catch up.
You need a standing team of at least, like, I don't know, 20 people to keep up with the changes. on Twilio and the providers.
Just add another very, very quick one. So, at what point does it cross over to be a copyright line? Because if you look at someone like Superwire, that came along with language, then application markup language, just similarly head in the hand, okay, how many think it's Twilio could be like, that's not necessarily a great. Yeah. So I think how much it just kind of almost cut and pasting Twilio into something else. It's a bit complicated.
I actually left there's an open Slack from the guys. I left the Slack because it was crazy. The sign of what is
So just before you, Mark, do you want to add on?
I was just going to comment. I don't think that, from my perspective, the first interest that Twilio's going to have is C functions as a result. In the telco world, virtualized EPC, we can have key gateways and resource. It's very much like but from their perspective, I think having those electronic users to present IoT constructs and application development, we as a strategy guide is supposed to
By the way, just also the thought on that, I think it's really, if you don't look at it strategically, but just the latency and the fact that they can deploy IoT gateways or packet gateways close to where their IoT systems operate can be one of the trivial reasons to do that. We are doing the same. We have in some countries legal issues, in some countries latency issues, and we actually deploy there as well regional packet gateways to break out the traffic. So that's maybe just a very simple explanation besides all the strategic ones mentioned.
Mark, go for it. Disruptive question. 2010, somebody called Jeff Lawson came to me and demoed Twilio, and I showed that, hey, isn't this great? But yeah, back then we told him which managed to be the rest is history. Then for the last 10 years, I studied network effects in digital platforms, and normally the winner takes most in these platforms. Trying to look at the next instead of trying to copy.
I think it should be. So from my perspective, programmable telecoms or CPaaS, however you want to call it, is one part of the stack. But and I try to also depict that a bit. For me, the future carrier stack is overall and programmability over the assets you have. That may not be the next big thing, but it may be just more than using communications or programmable communications or communications platforms as one narrow sample. But overall, if you make the stack on top of your asset, if you make that programmable, and if you expose capabilities there, I think there's a much broader spectrum of value creation you enable than just focusing on comms. But yeah, I can yet for now not think beyond that, but I certainly think if we as carriers would think of programmable telecoms, we should think also programmable connectivity, of exposing our, I don't know, quality on our networks or whatever, multiple network augmentation, things like that. Yeah.
So to your point, there are a number of people who are actively working on the next disruptive thing within the programmable telecom space. So absolutely, I think it's not necessarily a public discussion, but there is definitely quite a few private conversation happening in this space that actually, to both Sebastian and Martin's point, are focused more on the experience than the into the alternatives.
What about the argument that my suggestion would be start the problem you're trying to solve?
Exactly.
I just have one little comment I'd like to make to that actually, and part of it is that I think that perhaps the space to look at is natural language processing, natural language understanding, and putting computers on the end of a lot of this communication rather than just mediating it. But I think the big question actually is, can a company like Twilio pull a Google? In other words, break out of the space where they built a really compelling early lead with a set of technology and actually turn into a company that can innovate across a range of technologies, or will they just be the kind of the programmable telecoms guys? And I think that's the big question. Will Twilio manage to pull a Google or not?
Mark,
I think fine fault to some of them. You go and see some right now, there's some way that you
software stack, but they don't think the software stack would give an application. The big challenges in my company was making through it with Salesforce. It's the integration of the application is where it's at right now. So you can create an application integration environment. I think that solves a lot of problems, make it really easy for everyone pays on SI companies like brand to a brand and do that for you.
MuleSoft will do that for me. Do you have a question moving back to that?
Yes.
And there is all these languages that fix, I'm sure that this is development in the cloud communications. And you're combining C+ with IoT. Do you see a great future there, and what will be some use cases that would be willing to invest more efforts in?
So I think CPaaS in a narrow sense that we talk only about communications. Of course, IoT devices may send SMS and use the CPaaS platform, but I think in terms of IoT, you can do IoT the legacy way and provision using parts the legacy way, or you can do it the IT way, as I was showing it. I think we see some more conservative carriers, and I wouldn't exclude even ourselves, who are very conservative also in that business. So they have a classic process of provisioning SIMs, of developing them, of making parameters available, and of not making some parameters available. And we have some more modern companies that are a bit more progressive on that. And I think, of course, if you offer an IoT product, you need to make it programmable, and you need to offer parameters, and you may need also to interpret parameters for the customer to actually give them more than just the technology. And I have looked at, so getting into wholesale just a year ago, I've looked at what we offer, I've looked at what some competitors offer, and I really see a difference there in the way they make this, they expose it in a way you can order SIMs. I mean, it's an end-to-end process, and some make it very easy, some make it very hard. And I think what we as DT did in the end is as well to I've forgotten the name now, but there's a spin-off that we have that focuses on IoT with our connectivity, but essentially did much better than ourselves directly on this programmable layer, on making it part of a business process when you order the IoT product, and not just give you SIM cards, give you connectivity, but leave the rest to the companies. I think that's what it's about. That's also what I meant earlier when I said the IoT paradigm needs to be part of the product. And that's essentially, I guess you could say, it's an influence of CPaaS, but I wouldn't say that CPaaS as such is more this overall exposure that you need to add on an IoT product.
Excellent. So we're coming up on lunchtime. So please, for the panel, give it a round of applause for excellent. Now, before everybody disappears, I need to get lunch set up. So Steve, Rob, I'm going to need you as my helpers to get all the sandwiches upstairs. Okay, so stay down here. We'll come down, let you know when the food is ready. Okay, there's a few more people here with plans, so don't worry, all the food's gone. By the time you get there, we'll be getting some more sandwiches. Okay, so again, thanks so much. As always with a great panel, we didn't ask any of the questions I've listed. It was all audience discussion, which was great, so thank you.
Their strategy, looking at what's running, get the office, get trying to do that, also looking at more faster, changing projects, trying to get the really always think we need to get a mission set, so we can get out and use it. And then you run it again. If you don't even work on that, maybe very, very busy. No doubt that you But you also need to have that project supporting onboarding before that's the same way. That's the way I do it. And you have to usually they don't expect the delay production. That's another problem. We can't do that. Mine's sending an email and then you're discussing it. You need to go all the time to It's really hard if you have to discuss the like singing fast event because that's really easy. People don't really understand the potential and people see Just building up service as they go, many companies produce things in 4 hours, they have also make that
Let me just tell this blessing of the audio. Well, either that I know, but this is actually better. It's got pretty good directional isolation. That's one of the reasons why I got it. So it's working.
I think the challenge sat down, I was writing this strategy slide there.
You've never written down the
Oh, I wrote.
Oh, yeah, okay.
He said, that's great, I go, so I'm not there, so it's important to start like services for that. So like at that time, we took some 3 years ago. His visionary was the high, right?
Yes, I agree completely. That was what he was saying.
I was joking.
No, like, yeah.
It's, I know it's just that you I said, you can see the collapse, the evident collapse of the computer. What we're going to do is that services that we don't
Well, you point at the section did you say about the second as well? How should we do that for you? Get the numbers. Because more translation program than the English program is actually you need to transform the mind, you need to transform the organization, you transform the psychology.
Everybody we were like every meal,
I really.
We moved from a fully network engineering network software. You probably have 3,000.
We do, but yes, you're right. The mindset of the paradigm and the society mentality is kind of what we are working in. And the reason that really think about yes, we do this, but how big the IPO is, like separate companies. Yes, we get it serving, but they're just serving people. They would say they would get to, and they would try to do that. They would try to make some layer. At least somehow just we make the assets available. They do it for the APIs they have. They try to run some. They could, but they don't have the self-understanding, and we wouldn't. I guess I'm not sure about the calculation. We have it all, but we don't have still. That's not enough. You can have one ingredient.
The hardest thing, I was just to basically protect the focus and be at that level. But so for me, it was easy to say that I worked my way up through a lot of things, so to speak. And then right up, it was really looked at this and said, this is really.
Yeah, but that's again like this. If I go to people and say automation, they think again that right? And this one is really cool. People generations. I mean, it's a good laser.
What's the alternative?
I would give it away.
James,
One of my stories.
Right.
Right now, it's being down to the weeds, negotiating climate change.
It's interesting because I went through.
Way too long. And they go,
Some of the things I might have said.
By people like me and Andreas, who use technology SBC as a rapid and useful resource as well.
I do get hard, not just AI. It's very complete.
If you think about anything in the moving world, right? I'm really old started in small programming language well, and there's a lot of a number of guys, and I was just
Yeah, it was interesting.
different coding abilities. And then so you can see the guys who's going to sit there and say, and that's fine. And after a while, they get paid shit loads. So it's still using that, and everyone they got the right. And then there's other dudes running around who go, you know what, I'm going to
Yeah, I'm sorry.
every kind of new wave comes out. And I've got a group of teachers. And you know, when I presented speech early, when I
Yeah, thank
There are 250 people, small organizations, and are the 50, of course, they'll represent kind of their opinion. I mean, they are waiting, they don't want to waste the way they say, very well suited in the past. That's not do anything, they don't even say, I don't want to do this, they say, let's not change anything, because, we're very successful, we're proud of it, and we don't want to do it. We don't want you to change either, because we might come back to that. You might even succeed in what you're saying, that would be the worst, right? I don't know how to do it. It's me, I think, also a transformation program, an upskilling program, whatever else first, before you start talking about it, that people see the potential, need to explain the potential, not I don't know, it's not just technical, I really believe in this, or I really think this is like
it's hard to be a company like yours, you have to find people that see the value and will get a return on that value.
Especially in Germany, you can be fired essentially there until the day you retire. It's like the same when you have free or when you have other things, and people like the minute you so we are on before reorg, and the first message we get from our management is don't worry, like we'll have the next year, and from that moment on legally you cannot change anything for 3 years, be safe for 3 years. That's the message that's committed, and I'm saying, well, wait a second, like check with now or tomorrow, because if you tell me there's no change for the next 2 years, what do I want to do here? And the majority of the messages people didn't get them. And what's that? One he didn't get it. We go half an hour when we go and they said, what do you actually do? Like, I just told you back then that you don't understand. And I'm saying, no, he said there's not going to be any evolution for the next 2 years. It's not about my job is thing. I know I can go out there and make like this, and you do stuff. The point is, I want to change because I don't, I want to be an organization that can actually improve it. And that's the problem. And this is really not understood by the majority, at least of the. Maybe because we were staying, or maybe because we were, I don't know, we had Quebec, or maybe because it's in Germany, but it's really absolutely not the mindset that you really want. Career. Why not?
Yeah, I call it enabling us. So, it's enabling us. Whether we take that opportunity or not.
Yeah.
They're enabling us.
At least it's visible and they show us what's there. And that's, I think you're right. That's the thing, I guess, what we need to present over and over. And
I would imagine that I would be working with this other company that the taxi driver will be taken out to find me. I did, when he called up. Yeah, I'm here, dude. That's because a cloud company, if you know what I mean, was talking to some dude at a taxi application company, and they had a problem to sign an SMS. Was it enabling you to find that person, or vice versa? So, for the loss of $25 taxi fare, paying 5 cents for a 1 minute call. So
There's again use case. You don't start with, we have there's use case, there's value behind it, and you say, you know, you can put two numbers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, my boss very stupidly used to know, well, he knows the CEO and thinks very well, and he always asks me to go and present.
Hey, how's it going? Good. You get us to work if you better. Oh, yeah. So it's a 5. So the only question I was going to ask Steve was, what's missing in CPAS? And it was like, the conversation just had such a life of its own. As you can see, the gap is still so massive in terms of, you know, you have to develop your API, and still it's such a in the way to just having a frank conversation.
They've got such a laser on what's missing.
Yes.
I don't know if we'll get that or not.
Well, I think that where it's heading in this app.
I've had a short version. Well, there's nothing missing from it. It's just that everything that's okay, you need over there.
Yes.
Everything that's okay, you need over there.
Yes.
No one knows how to code an API.
That's right. Let me get the biscuits upstairs. Let me check your life. Hey, how you doing? I'm fine, thanks. It'll be on my brother. Okay.
I guess that's the.
Exactly. Finally on the street. Was it not like no? First thing this morning, the old laptop I got, it just wouldn't run. Yesterday, it just kept crashing. Couldn't get it. Instead of on the street, it just chucked. So after about 6 times of trying to get that to work, booting, logging in. So we go to work. We also do recording, and I actually stop that. Just making sure everybody's safe. Yeah. Yes.
Well, yeah, it's in the country, you know, I'm wrong, I'll ask the wrong things. Okay. On the scorecard. And you have to go through the whole registration, unfortunately. This seems to work. Okay, testing, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Okay, testing, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. No, it's pick up. This is getting. Okay, testing, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Never easy.